Have you ever felt?
Are you listening? Damn.
Okay, we're going to tie probably the most popular nymph pattern in the world, but we're going to simplify it quite a bit and make it super easy. We're going to tie a pheasant tail. We're tying it on a Daiichi 1180 hook in size 14. And yes, it is technically a dry fly hook, but just because a hook says that it's made for something, it doesn't mean you can't use it for other stuff. These hooks are very versatile in pretty much any application. I'm going to put a 2.4 millimeter bead on it, and I've got it set in this little tool so that I can put the small side of the bead on the hook the proper way. And once I get it on there, I'll just flip the hook around. So now it's seated in the vise, just how I need to tie a fly. For this fly, I'm using Danville 70 denier in black. And to start your thread on the hook, I'm going to come from behind the hook and hold the tag end with my offhand and start wrapping the thread forward a little bit. And then before I let go, I'm going to wrap the thread back down to where I tied in, and now I'm completely tied in and I can cut off that tag end. Alright, so I'm going to dress the hook, which means I'm going to take my thread all the way back to about where the barb would be. You can't really see it because the vise is in the way, but that's about as far back as you want to wrap the hook. Now, pheasant tail can sometimes be intimidating because sometimes you'll get pieces that aren't any good. You'll get pieces that are short or brittle. But this is a pretty good representation of a good center tail of a pheasant. So on this one you can use both sides of the pheasant. On some of the packs of pheasant that you'll get some feathers where you can only use one side. And it's very apparent which is the good side to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take probably about 5 or 6 or 7 of these fibers just like this. And instead of cutting them off the stem, I'm just going to pull those off. So here I've got my clump of pheasant. This is the tips of the pheasant. And I'm going to tie those in as a tail. Now, a lot of pheasant tails that I see have a tail that's way too long. So you want the tail to be just a little bit shorter than the body of the fly. And so the easiest way to do that is just put your pheasant tail down, regardless of how long it is, and give it, 2 or 3 loose wraps. And then pull your pheasant tail to the proper length. So that's probably good right about there. So I'm going to actually back off one of these wraps and kind of snug it up. And then I'm going to take these fibers and hold those up and advance my thread underneath the fibers. And the reason I do that is so I can tie in my rib of the pheasant tail. So I'm using small UTC wire in gold color. And so what I'm going to do is, well, first of all, when you cut the wire off of your spool, you always want to make sure you have some alternate scissors so you don't use your good scissors to cut wire with. But I'm going to take my thread all the way behind the bead, and I'm kind of going to put my wire in there kind of at a perpendicular to the hook shank, and then just wrap over the top of it. And this pheasant tail can kind of get in the way a little bit. But once you have it kind of tied in, I'm going to do the same thing. Just pull it to length, and I'm good to go. So now I can kind of take my fingers and hold these pheasant tail fibers back as I wrap that wire back down the shank now. That's kind of a funky technique, but you will get used to it as you tie these. So the next step now is to wrap these pheasant tail fibers around the hook shank. Alright, so this can be kind of tricky because the pheasant tail fibers are pretty fragile. It might take you 2 or 3 of these before you actually get it right. But before I do this, I'm going to take one final wrap behind these tails to tie that wire in behind the actual pheasant tail fibers. And then I'm going to hold those back and go back in front. At this point, I mean, I guess you could start wrapping your pheasant forward, but we're going to build up a nice taper of this body. As you can see, I keep spinning my thread, and what that does is it kind of unwinds it so it's nice and flat. You can see how flat that thread is right there. So as I do this, now I'm going to go up the hook shank, and I'm going to make it a little bit fatter up here than it is in the back. And it doesn't have to be perfect because the pheasant tail will be wrapped over the top of it. See, I already broke one of those fibers off. That's fine. So there you see I've got kind of a taper going on. Now I'm going to take those fibers and I'm going to wrap them away from me at first. So I'm going to push those away. And as I wrap this first wrap, if I kind of wiggle them back and forth, it will kind of distribute the pheasant tails right where I want them to be. So this is going to be a lot of fingers when I do this because I don't use hackle pliers. I think hackle pliers break a lot of pheasant tails. So once I get that first wrap, I'm just going to kind of pinch it with this finger and then come underneath it and do the same thing all the way up the fly. See what I'm doing there? Or if you have a rotary vise, this would be a great time to use it. So you can see how I'm wrapping that up the hook. So I'm going to wrap that to all the way behind the bead. And once it's up there, I'm going to tie that off. And this pheasant tail we're showing you is not going to have a wing case or anything. I mean, there's a fly called a Frenchie that's a very simple fly as well that's similar to this. We'll show you how to do that as well kind of in this video. But basically on a normal pheasant tail you could pull these back, tie back over them so that you could have a wing case. But in this case I'm just going to cut them off. So now the pheasant tail is very fragile, and if a trout tooth caught one of those it would just rip it up and then you have a fly that basically is worthless. So what I'm going to do with my wire is I'm going to counter wrap that the opposite way I wrap my pheasant tail. And so as you can see, as I go up the fly, you should be able to see that the direction that my wire is going is opposite to the direction that the pheasant tail is. So you can see they're kind of crisscrossing. So even if the pheasant tail gets broken at this point, it will stay right where I want it to be. So I'm going to tie that off, put some wraps in front, and instead of cutting the wire off, I'm just going to helicopter that wire and it'll come right off. So if you wanted to tie a Frenchie, all you would do is put some pink dubbing to cover up that black thread, maybe even a little bit further back, about to here, and then you'd have a Frenchie. Really good pattern, designed by Lance Egan. He's a competitive fisherman, fishes a lot. But since this is more of a traditional style pheasant tail, we're just going to use peacock herl. So I've got 2 strands of peacock herl, and you know what, I'm probably going to use 3 on this. So I've got 3 strands of peacock herl. And you can see the butts are kind of nasty. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim those butts, and I'm going to use the butts. A lot of people like to tie it in by the tips. Not me. I still prefer to tie in the butts. So I'm going to hold those right behind the bead and tie those in. You notice that I trim the stuff before I tie it in. That saves me a step up here on the vise, so I don't have to cut off any tag ends. So I have that tied in. And make sure it goes back as far as you want it to go. So the thorax is a little bit shorter than the body, but it shouldn't be so short that it's right up by the bead. So once I have that tied in, I advance my thread forward and I just wrap this peacock forward. So there we have it. I'm going to tie this off now. And you can either trim your peacock off with scissors, or you can break it. This is pretty durable stuff, and I don't want to mess it up, so I'll just trim it off. Now, the peacock also is somewhat fragile, so one trick to really add durability to your fly is take your thread, wrap it through the peacock, and then back forward, and you can't even tell that I did that. So from here, I just whip finish. And I'll add just a little bit of loon head cement, and we're good to go. So when you're putting this loon stuff on, if you just stick it right on the bead, it will kind of seep down in. Alright, so that's a really basic pheasant tail. No wing case, no legs, but the fish absolutely eat this fly. If you want to see the fly with the wing case and with the legs, there will be a link after this video that shows you where that one is.